Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into the dim corridors of an empire that once stretched across 3 continents. And you pad softly across tiled floors still warm from centuries of footsteps. Lantern light wobbles on marble as you take it all in. And for a moment, you feel like you're trespassing in someone else's dream. You breathe in spices drifting from a distant kitchen. Hear a muezzin's call echo over a city that never really sleeps, and realize you're standing inside the last centuries of the Ottoman Empire. And just so we're clear, if you actually tried to wander around 1700s Istanbul like this, you'd probably get lost, dehydrated, and maybe accidentally join a guild you never asked to join. So yeah, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. No, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step out into the dusky streets of Ottoman Istanbul, and the whole city seems to breathe. You can feel the empire around you, an enormous, creaking machine that spans from the Balkans to Arabia. Its power is still immense, though you sense it's not quite the unstoppable force it once was. You passed janissaries lounging by a fountain, their uniforms sharp but their discipline, well, let's just say historians still argue whether they were elite warriors in this era or more like a very confident, very unionized cosplay club. That's your first joke. Pace yourself. As you navigate the narrow alleys, you feel how layered everything is. This is a place where caravans carry silk and coffee, where ships glide along the bottom, where the imperial court sits behind gates carved like lace. The mainstream fact slips naturally into your awareness. The Ottomans really did control key trade routes that linked Europe and Asia, a position that enriched them for centuries and fueled both admiration and jealousy from rivals. But tonight, you feel the tension beneath that. Wealth like a violin string stretched a little too tight. You continue walking, and the scent of roasted chestnuts follows you like a friendly ghost. You overhear merchants arguing about taxes, sailors grumbling about the weather, and scholars debating everything from astrology to philosophy. That last one reminds you of a quirky tidbit. Ottoman coffee houses were once accused of being hotbeds of mischief because people sat around discussing news and ideas. Imagine being arrested for excessive caffeine and opinions. Honestly, that's half of Twitter. You reach the edge of the bustling Grand Bazaar, and the sensory overload nearly sweeps you away. The clatter of coins, the sparkle of lamps, the soft thud of rugs being dusted, it's all alive. But as you drift deeper, you sense the empire's problems tucked into its corners like forgotten debts. Provincial governors growing to bold, European powers poking around like nosy neighbors, rebellions simmering in places the sultan can't quite see from his gilded throne. You pass a group of scholars whispering about the empire's long attempts at reform. Some point to the tulip era, earlier in the 18th century, when the court embraced European style art, gardens, and asexual tulips as status symbols. You pluck one in your imagination and tuck it behind your ear. Congratulations, you're now part of a fashion trend that was once so popular it triggered an economic bubble. Historians still argue whether this tulip madness was harmless fun or a sin the elites had drifted way too far from reality. Crossing a stone bridge, you see the Bosporus, shimmering like spilled moonlight. Ships slide past, some carrying grain, others carrying diplomats with very dramatic hats. Political envoys always look like they're auditioning for a peer drama, and tonight is no different. You sense the growing pressure from Europe, where new technologies, philosophies, and weapons are reshaping power. The Ottomans know they need to modernize, but like someone trying to update their phone software, they keep postponing it and hoping it'll fix itself. Your second joke, stay hydrated. You arrive at Topkapi Palace, the imperial heart. Guards eye you cautiously as you glide through courtyards filled with cypress trees and the faint murmur of fountains. Inside, silk curtains sway, and scribes bend over documents that outline taxes, land grants, and letters from restless provinces. You peek into the Haramnot, the Hollywood version, but the real one. A complex institution of politics, education, and strict hierarchy. You catch a glimpse of the valid sultan, his mother quietly orchestrating alliances with the grace of a chess grandmaster. If power has a spine, she's part of it. As you continue, you sense the growing friction between tradition and reform. Some officials push for updated armies, modern schools, and new legal codes. Others cling to the old ways like a cat refusing to leave a warm couch. You pass a group arguing about whether the janissaries should be restructured or just bribed with another pay raise. They choose to raise your car. You drift into a quiet library room heavy with the scent of old parchment. Scholars study maps of the empire, tracing its borders with anxious fingers. You overhear one muttering about the increasing nationalist movements in the Balkans. Another grumbles about Russia's ambitions. A third points out that the empire's treasury could definitely use and here comes your third joke. Even 18th century accountants. Nui reworking on it is code for we have no idea where the money went. You step outside again, and the city feels different. The wind has shifted, and with it, the empire's fortunes. The 19th century looms like a storm cloud. Reform is coming una vez, inconsistent, but unavoidable. You picture bureaucrats drafting the Tanzimat edicts, the sweeping reforms that would reshape administration, military organization, and the rights of citizens. You don't know it yet, but these changes will spark debates still echoing in Turkish memory today. As you wander toward a tea house by the water, you overhear musicians strumming lutes and singing ballads about distant battles, lost love, and heroics. But underneath the melodies lies a quiet melancholy, the sense that something is ending, even if no one will say it aloud. The empire stands, tall but unsteady, beautiful but brittle. You sip imaginary tea, watch the city lights ripple across the bus, and prepare to move forward with the story, because the cracks forming beneath your feet are about to widen. Your teacup is still warm in your hands when the ripples on the Bosporus seem to sharpen, as if the whole empire takes one long, orniasi breath. You stand, stretch a little, and begin drifting through the changing mood of the Ottoman world, where reform feels less like a choice and more like someone shaking you awake because the house is creaking in suspicious ways. You can practically sense the 19th century tugging at your sleeves, whispering, "Hey buddy, things are about to get complicated." You wander through a narrow street where posters announcing new regulations flutter like nervous birds in the breeze. The Tanzimat reforms have begun those grand attempts to modernize the empire's creaky institutions. The mainstream fact lands on your shoulder gently. In 1839, the Hatwai Zerif of Gohain promised sweeping administrative changes, equal legal status for all subjects, and wait for it, the radical concept that officials shouldn't take bribes. You shake your head, because honestly, that's like issuing a decree that water should try being less wet. As you stroll, shopkeepers debate the new reforms with an energy usually reserved for sports rivalries. Some praise the changes, thrilled about the promise of fairness. Others muttered that the empire is trying to be too European and should instead double down on tradition. You hear the phrase. Historians still argue whether these reforms were bold modernization or just panicked damage control. And there it is, your scholarly debate requirement, delivered with all the delicacy of someone carrying a tray of baklava across a windy bridge. The air feels sharper as you approach a military drill ground. Rows of soldiers attempt to march in crisp European formations, their boots thudding on the packed earth. A Western advisor shouts instructions in accented Turkish while the recruits try, and spectacularly fail, to stay in sync. Your first joke of the section arrives on cue. Watching them march, you can help thinking they look like a group of cousins who only practice their wedding dance. Once the general idea is there, but oh boy, the execution. And yet, beneath the awkwardness, you see the empire striving. The Janissaries, once elite, but now stubbornly resisting change, have been eliminated in the dramatic, auspicious incident. That means new troops, modern troops are. But cannons are updated, uniforms redesigned, and officers sent abroad to study European tactics. You can almost feel the empire cracking open old habits to let unfamiliar light in. You keep moving, drifting past a school built under the new education reforms. Inside, young men pore over math, geography, and science. Subjects that once sat outside the traditional curriculum. A professor gestures at a chalkboard covered in equations, and you overhear your quirky tidbit of the night. One Ottoman engineer in this era tried to design a submarine shaped like a giant metal fish. It technically worked, if you consider almost sinking, but not quite a success. You filed that away future. Trivia night. Secured. You step into a bustling port town, maybe Izmir or Saloniki, you can't tell. The boundaries blur as you float forward. Greek merchants haggle with Armenian traders. Jewish families stroll along the quay. Turkish sailors unload cargo, and Ladino and Arabic mingle with Ottoman Turkish in the air. The empire is a mosaic, and you can feel its beauty and its fragility in equal measure. But nationalism is humming beneath the surface, like a quiet bat. In the Balkans, independence movements stir Serbs, Greeks, Bulgarians each, pushing against the imperial center with growing force. You overhear a heated conversation in a smoky tavern where someone insists the empire must grant autonomy or risk losing entire regions. Another retorts that giving an inch means losing a mile. You sip your imaginary drink and decide not to get involved. You are here for bedtime storytelling, not diplomatic stress. A storm rolls across the sky as you drift into the capital again. The clouds bruise purple, and the rain begins to patter on cobblestones. You duck under an awning near the Sublime Port, where a messenger rushes past, carrying documents from distant provinces. You glimpsed just enough to understand revolts, foreign presser, budget problems, not exactly the sort of news that helps you sleep. Still, the empire tries to reinvent itself, one decree at a time. Railroads thread across the land. Telegraph wires stretch like metallic spider webs, and new commercial laws attempt to stabilize the economy. You walk along the tracks of a freshly built railway, and for your second joke you can help imagining the first train ride. Everyone nervously clutching their seat because they not convinced a giant metal box should move that fast. And honestly, relatively, you wander onward through a modernizing cityscape where gas lamps glow, printing presses churn out newspapers, and cafes buzz with political gossip. Some of the intellectuals you pass are part of the Young Ottomans, a reformist movement pushing for constitutional government. They distribute pamphlets advocating a blend of Islamic principles and democratic ideas. You pause, listening to their spirited debate. UKNO-TLL succeed briefly in 1876, when the empire adopts its first constitution. The excitement feels electric, like everyone-esque, collectively hitting the update my system button. But the Sultan suspends it soon after, and the mood shifts back to uncertainty. Your third joke leans in when someone insists, the constitution will definitely last this time. Sure, buddy. And you definitely only meant to take a 5-minute nap this afternoon. Night settles deep and heavy as you step into a quieter neighborhood. Laundry hangs between buildings. Cats prowl stone stairways, and families eat dinner behind open windows. Despite the empire's tremors, life is tender here, steady in its own rhythm. You pass a grandmother grinding spices, and her laughter reminds you that even in times of upheaval, people still cook, gossip, fall in love, argue about whose tea is better, and go on living. The scent of rain-soaked earth accompanies you as you drift toward the edge of the city. Above you, the stars shimmer faintly, as if watching the empire wrestle with its own reflection. Modernity pushes one way, tradition tugs another. Foreign powers pressure from outside, while new identities stir within. Your final joke surfaces as you watch a bureaucrat trying to balance ledgers stacked taller than he is. He sighs dramatically, muttering, "This would all make more sense if the numbers would stop multiplying." Same, friend. Same. By now, you can feel history tightening around you like a cloak. The reforms have reshaped the empire, but they haven't saved it from the storms gathering on the horizon. The next gust of wind carries the scent of gunpowder and the distant drumbeat of a world about to plunge into global conflict. And you, still wandering, sense that the cracks beneath your feet are about to turn into chasms. A low rumble rolls across the horizon, and you feel the ground shift beneath your steps, as if the whole empire exhales in dread. You're no longer strolling through reform-era streets. Now you're trudging straight into the storm of the early 20th century, where alliances tighten like knots, borders blur like wet ink, and every choice the Ottoman leadership makes feels like trying to patch a sinking ship with decorative tiles. The air tastes metallic, and even the seagulls circling above the Bosphorus seem anxious, which is impressive because those birds fear nothing. You drift through Istanbul as the empire stumbles into the era that historians politely call complicated and less polite people call a spectacular mess. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 surges past you like a sudden wind. Crowds gather in the streets, chanting about constitutional government, and the mainstream fact slides into place. The Committee of Union and Progress for short forces the restoration of the Constitution suspended decades earlier. Soldiers celebrate by firing their rifles into the air, which is super festive unless you happen to be a roof tile. You watch the city pulse with hope, suspicion, and the energy of a group project where no one actually agrees on what the project is. As you float through this new political landscape, the streets glow with lanterns and tension. Reformers argue with conservatives. Idealists clash with pragmatists. And journalists scribble articles so fast their inkpots tremble. Everyone insists they know the right path. And historians still argue whether the Young Turks were visionary modernizers, overconfident revolutionaries, or a little of both. Spoiler: a little of both is usually the safest historical answer. Right next to context matters. You make your way toward a military barracks where officers in crisp uniforms discuss the Balkan Wars of 1912. 1913 battles that carve deep scars into the empire before the world even gets to the big war. Maps lie sprawled on tables, territories marked with frantic arrows. You hover over one and feel a pang of loss as the empire's Balkan holdings slip away like sand through tired fingers. Your first joke for this section sneaks in when one officer mutters, "At least things can't get worse," which in history is basically a magical incantation that guarantees things absolutely will. As the Balkan Wars end, the empire is bruised, shaken, but still standing barely. And before there's time to recover, the world tilts into a darker spiral. You step into a dim cafe where diplomats whisper about Serbia, Russia, Germany, all those European dominoes lining up for disaster. The Ottoman Empire, weakened and indecisive, hesitates on the edge. Its leaders debate alliances, like someone trying to pick a phone plan they know they'll regret. Either way, then the fateful decision sweeps you along. The empire signs on with the Central Powers. A mainstream fact glints at your ankle. The Ottomans enter World War I in late 1914, believing a bold move might restore lost prestige. You feel the city shift under the weight of it. Men are drafted, supplies rationed, and fear curls in alleyways like smoke. You shake off a chill and suddenly find yourself trudging through the Dardanelles campaign the Gallipoli. Front-where cliffs loom like stone giants above soldiers huddled in trenches. The air smells of salt, sweat, and the bitter sting of conflict. You hear shouts, clattering equipment, and waves thrashing at the shoreline. Even in this soft and bedtime-friendly version, you feel the gravity. The Ottomans, under commanders like Mustafa Kemal, hold the line against Allied forces in one of the war's most dramatic and devastating theaters. And yes, your second joke perks up when a soldier mutters, "The British said this would be quick." Sure. And I said I'd only check my phone for 5 minutes before bed. You drift away from the front, grateful to leave the tension behind, and wander into the vast deserts of the Middle Eastern front. Caravan tracks crisscross the sand like fading signatures. Ottoman troops march under a merciless sun while local revolts simmer. You overhear officers trying to manage supply problems so chaotic even modern event planners would cry. And then your quirky tidbit drifts in on a hot wind. Some Ottoman units use camels, not just for transport, but occasionally to pull small artillery pieces. Imagine a camel staring you down as it drags a cannon. It's wild, weird, and somehow very on-brand for wartime improvisation. Night falls, and with it, an overwhelming sense of unraveling. You wander through the empire's heart again, where scarcity tightens like a fist. Civilians line up for bread. Families whisper about sons at distant fronts, and newspapers announce losses with a grim regularity that thins everyone's breath. You watch children play with improvised toys, laughing despite everything, a fragile kind of joy that always finds a crack to shine through. As you turn a corner, a gust of cold wind carries word of yet another crisis. Epidemics, displacement, and political fractures splinter the empire while the war grinds on. You hear a scholar mutter, "The empire is fighting on too many fronts." His colleague replies, "No, it's collapsing on too many." They're both terrifyingly correct. The war drags to its brutal conclusion. You can feel the empire's exhaustion like a weight on your shoulders. When the armistice of Mudros lands in late 1918, it feels less like peace and more like a quiet breaking. Allied forces occupy parts of the empire. Ships crowd the harbors, and Istanbul once, the proud seat of sultans, echoes with foreign boots. You drift past Galata Tower and overhear shopkeepers whispering about the Treaty of Sevres, the proposed dismemberment of the empire. Maps and newspapers look like patchwork quilts, stitched by someone who didn't understand borders or feelings. One man points at a map and says, "If this holds, what's left of us?" That's your third joke, delivered gently as he adds, "I've seen jigsaw puzzles with more dignity." But beneath the grief, beneath the despair, something else begins to stir. The empire is crumbling, yes, but you sense a new current rising from within the rubble. Not restoration, not nostalgia, something sharper, bolder, and determined. Resistance. It's faint now, just a breath, a whisper, but you can feel it gathering like a storm, and you step toward it. That whisper of resistance grows stronger as you step onto a dirt road leading out of the exhausted, occupied Ottoman capital. The sky feels wider out here, the air sharper, and you sense the world tilting toward something new, something still unsteady, still forming, like a potter's wheel spinning a fresh shape from clay that remembers being an empire. You follow the road northward, your footsteps sinking with a rising rhythm echoing across Anatolia. Determination, defiance, and the quiet, burning belief that collapse isn't the end unless you decide it is. You pass small villages, first humble clusters of wooden houses where people gather around stoves, whispering about foreign troops stationed in their towns and about leaders who've given up hope. But then someone mentions a name spoken with a spark. Mustafa Kemal. The mainstream fact slips softly into place. He leaves Istanbul in 1919 and travels to Samsun, beginning the movement that will eventually reshape everything you've been wandering through. To the villagers, he's not yet the founder of anything. He's a determined officer with sharp eyes, relentless discipline, and the uncanny ability to convince people that impossible things are actually totally doable if you're stubborn enough. You follow those murmurs like breadcrumbs until you reach a hillside town where banners hang from balconies and volunteers gather in dusty squares. The national resistance is growing cells of determination scattered across Anatolia, knitting themselves together. You drift through a meeting room where the walls glow warm in lamplight. Delegates debate strategy in heated but hopeful tones. Someone slams their fist onto a table for emphasis. Someone else mutters about supplies. A third person suggests, jokingly, that if coffee runs out, morale will collapse faster than the old empire. That's your first. Joe, caffeine remains the backbone of all major world events. From Sivas to Era, you trace the meetings where representatives vow to protect the nation's lands and future. You feel the shift, citizens becoming stakeholders, soldiers becoming leaders, communities becoming engines of change. And historians still argue whether the momentum came more from top-down leadership or bottom-up determination. But you can sense both forces here, interwoven like threads in a kilim rug, drifting southwest. You find the smell of wood smoke curling through a crisp morning as villagers gather to hear news. Occupation zones expanding, foreign plans growing bolder, treaties threatening to carve Anatolia into fragments. You picture the Treaty of Sevres, again the one that sliced the empire into unrecognizable shapes, and you shiver, even though the sun is warm. But then a courier arrives breathless, shouting that the Grand National Assembly has formed in a government independent of the Sultan. A government of resistance. You feel the earth shift under your feet again, this time in a hopeful direction. You follow the courier's trail to Ankara, a modest town buzzing with purpose. Typists hammer at keys, generals stomp across courtyards, and delegates argue in smoky rooms about budgets, borders, and battle strategies. The atmosphere crackles with urgency, but also with the uncanny sense that you're witnessing the scaffolding of a nation going up in real time. And here comes your quirky tidbit. Some meeting rooms were so cold in early Ankara winters that delegates kept their coats, scarves, and occasionally blankets wrapped around them while discussing national policy. Imagine writing a constitution while slowly turning into a human burrito. You drift into a training camp where soldiers prepare for battles ahead against occupying forces, against armies far better equipped, against odds that look terrible, even by cinematic standards. You watch young volunteers practice rifle drills, their breath turning to mist in the morning air. Commanders pace beside them, adjusting stances, correcting grips. Someone cracks a joke about how their boots are older than their recruits, and everyone laughs because laughter keeps your spine from snapping in times like these. You move again, this time toward the Western Front, where earthworks scar the hills and trenches snake across the Greco-Turkish War sweeps past you in fragments. Soldiers waking before dawn, commanders poring over maps lit by lantern flames, villages caught in the tide of battle, the ground trembling with artillery that makes your chest feel hollow. Even in this softened, bedtime version, you sense the gravity of it, a desperate struggle for sovereignty, identity, and the right to define your own future. Then a rising surge of momentum pulls you along. The battles of Ayanan, where resistance forces prove their strength. Sakarya, where the fighting stretches for days on the banks of a dry riverbed. And finally, the Great Offensive, a push so decisive it feels like history snapping into a new alignment. You hear cheers. You hear relief. You hear exhausted soldiers laughing in disbelief. And your second joke arrives as one soldier says, "Well, that was easy," before immediately admitting he's kidding because he can't feel his legs or his sanity. After months of strain, the war ends. The occupying forces withdraw. The Treaty of Lausanne is Sindanu, internationally recognized border for a new state. You feel the victorious relief ripple across Anatolia like warm sunlight after a long winter. In 1923, the Republic of Turkey is proclaimed, and Ankara becomes its capital. The empire you've been wandering through, the one with gilded palaces, Janissary factions, bustling bazaars, and too many reform attempts to count, finally hands the torch to something new. You float into the early years of the Republic, where changes sweep through society like a brisk wind clearing old dust. Language reform, legal reform, educational reform, clothing regulations, alphabet shifts, new institutions rising from the foundations of older ones, citizens adjusting, learning, arguing, adapting, and someone mutters that reform fatigue is real, which might be the understatement of the century. You watch Mustafa Kemal Atatürk deliver speeches with the calm intensity of someone who thinks sleep is optional. His leadership shapes the new nation's identity in ways scholars will discuss, praise, critique, and debate far into the future. And your third joke settles gently into the mix. Someone in the audience whispers, "How does he give so many speeches?" A friend replies, "I'm starting to think he has actually 5 smaller Atatürks in a trench coat." You step bike, letting the noise fade into a hum. You've walked from imperial twilight to republican dawn. You've watched borders move, ideas collide, and people rebuild. The Ottoman Empire didn't simply fall. It transformed messily, painfully, and ultimately into something new. And now the night softens around you, inviting the final drift toward rest. The world grows gentler as you step away from the noise of history, letting the dust settle behind you. The roads you walked grow quiet, the lanterns dim, and the hills of Anatolia fade into soft silhouettes under a silvered sky. You feel the cool air wrap around you like a blanket, smoothing the edges of everything you've just witnessed. The shouts of soldiers and the debates of scholars fade first, slipping into memory like ripples settling on still water. Then the footfalls of travelers, the creak of old wooden carts, the murmurs of bustling cities, all dissolving into a long, deep exhale. Your breathing slows naturally, sinking with the gentle hush that now surrounds you. The past, with all its triumphs and turmoil, feels distant and quiet, like a story set carefully on a shelf. The people you met along the way, merchants, villagers, students, reformers, grow soft and faint, their voices drifting away like threads of smoke rising into a dusky sky. You keep walking, but your steps are slower now, almost floating, as though the ground has turned to clouds beneath you. The moon glows like a calm guardian, watching over the land that changed and rebuilt itself so many times. Even the wind softens into something like a whisper, brushing your shoulders in reassurance. And as the night leans closer, you feel a warm, peaceful stillness settling into your body, spreading gently from your chest outward. You made it through centuries tonight, through palaces and battlefields, through reforms and rebirth's end. Now there is nothing left to do but rest. Let the horizon fade. Let your eyes drift. Let the quiet carry you the rest of the way into sleep.